Hello, everybody. I'm Candace Vogler. I'm currently the chair of the philosophy department here at the University of Chicago. The talk that I'm going to be giving you today, called Good and Bad in Human Action, is a sort of a précis of a large project that I've been working on for a few years now that's taking all kinds of shape. Because it's from my current research, there's actually a lot more philosophy in this talk than there sometimes is in talks that I give at this particular event. I hope that'll be okay. It's kind of an occupational hazard. All right. Had Aristotle written the Nicomachean Ethics in English, he might have written, "Every sort of expert knowledge and every inquiry, and similarly every action and undertaking, seems to seek some good. Because of that, people are right to affirm that the good is that which all things seek." Close quote. Now, had Thomas Aquinas received an English language version of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, this is a translation from the text he was working from, he might have received this: "All arts and all teaching, and similarly every act and every choice, seem to have the attainment of some good as their object. For this reason, it has correctly been proclaimed that good is what all desire." Close quote. Now, Aquinas understood this point as an articulation of the constitutive principle of practical reason, a principle that, he argued, could not be blotted out from the heart of man. Like, you can't get rid of this thing. It's just in you. Surveying such thoughts in the 20th century, David Velleman, who's a philosopher from New York, wrote, in his mother tongue, "The agent portrayed in much philosophy of action is, let's face it, a square. He does nothing intentionally unless he regards it or its consequences as desirable. The reason is that he acts intentionally only when he acts out of a desire for some anticipated outcome, and in desiring that outcome, he must regard it as having some value. All of his intentional actions are therefore directed at outcomes regarded sub specie boni, under the guise of the good." That's a complaint. Now, I suppose that very few of us will think that the ancient thought about goodness, reason, and human action is going to fall by the wayside if it turns out that hipsters won't agree. That's not a normal way of defeating a venerable philosophical commonplace. But, I mean, at the very, and at the very least, the hipsters care about avoiding whatever bad is involved in being a square, right? I mean, there is a good and bad thing, even for the cool people, okay? I guess. I mean, I don't know in firsthand, but, okay. But are there really enough kinds of, I mean, look, there's many kinds of good, but are there really enough kinds of good to handle human pursuits generally? I mean, leave to one side the cases where someone does something on impulse that he later regrets. Leave aside things like small acts of pettiness or violence. Concentrate on the shabby things that people seem to have thought about in advance. Choose your favorite example. There's really a lot of them. Okay? In what sense can anyone even begin to suggest that your chosen example illustrates our ardent adherence to rational pursuit of the good? Now, there are some arguments that can be made straight away in response to that question. Here's one. Look, the way that we understand and apprehend intentional actions as such depends upon understanding their point, the reason for them, And to ask, why did you do that? Or like, what was the point of that? Is, in effect, to ask, what's the good of doing that? Those are roughly the same question in all of those cases. That is, it's pretty easy to construct an argument that claims that our very ability to pick out intentional actions from among the indefinitely many events that happen depends upon us understanding the intentional actions as open to sort of reason for acting seeking review. And to that extent, Aristotle's thought might be built into the basic architecture of our capacity to do things on purpose and to notice what other people are up to. So we have to see the point in order to understand what's going on. Now, so that's the way to do that argument fast. I fear that this is going to sound, excuse me, like one of those slippery philosophy tricks. There's a lot of those. And anyway, even if we do need to see how a person understands the point of what she's doing in order to understand what she's up to, doesn't this leave us having to call an awful lot of actions and goals good that would appear to be pretty far from anything a sensible person would understand as a good sort of thing to do or to try to make happen? Where do we look to find this good that people are supposedly going after all the time? Now, I'm going to sneak up on this serious and substantive question by way of some abstract points about human action. Pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. I'm not contagious, as far as I know. The first has to do with the most basic kind of good at issue in doing things. The second has to do with the kind of look to the future that belongs to doing things on purpose. Action is always future directed. You're always doing something. If I'm getting ready to do something, I haven't done it yet. It's kind of that simple. And the third has to do with how we assign responsibility for the consequences of what people do. The most basic orientation to good involved in intentional action attaches to basically the means-end structure of action and establishes what is supposed to happen next. I do A in order to do B. I do B in order to do C, and so on. Intentional action has this kind of calculative means-end structure. Break eggs in order to make the omelet, things like that. Okay, that structure, in turn, makes it possible to identify success, got the omelet, failure, whoops, not really, obstacles and interruptions. Without some way of identifying these, we don't have a concept of intentional action at all. A thing that you do is a thing that you can be interrupted in doing. It's a thing that can go well or badly. It's a thing that can succeed or fail. That just is built into the basic understanding of doing stuff on purpose, okay? We lose track of the kind of process at issues when people do things on purpose without this understanding of goal-directedness and the ability it gives us to identify obstacles, interruptions, and so on. Call this the low form of orientation to good and bad in human action. The things that are sort of ruled out as a problem, I mean, shown to be a problem by this feature, the things that are going to signal some sort of volitional, intellectual, or appetitive problems are things like attempting to do things that it is manifestly not in your power to do. For instance, to leap across Lakeshore Drive in a single bound, or attempting to combine pursuits that cannot be done at the same time, you know, smoking while scuba diving, or failing to stop doing what you're doing in order to attain some end when you already have attained your end. okay? I mean, this is one that academics might feel more strongly than the rest of you. But having already edited, revised, and submitted the page proofs for your beautiful new book, you keep pulling up the file officially in order to work on the page proofs. Like, better check them one more time. Okay? Or continuing to deploy means to an end, having ascertained that those means are not going to work. You already have emptied your bag completely in search of your lost keys, and you keep returning to that bag to look for those keys. You already know this is going to fail. These kinds of problems can be identified as problems in light of this low, means-end form of orientation to good and bad in action. Okay? What this form establishes is what is supposed to happen next when I set out to do something. So I set up an automatic transfer to a creditor on my bank's website. My bills are supposed to get paid. They've got a calendar, you can tell them when and all that stuff. We agree to meet for lunch at noon. We're supposed to be there. It tells us how things are supposed to go. Okay? This kind of orientation to the future is fundamentally different from a kind that was sort of invented, as near as I can tell, long after Aristotle and Aquinas were gone. It's a kind that's associated with modern science. It is fundamentally predictive. Okay? It sort of looks at the world this way. One thing happens, followed by another, and then another, and then another. If you're thinking like a physicist, everything that happens will be yet another physical event. There's no such thing as what's supposed to happen in this sense. There's no such thing as an obstacle or an interruption in this. If it happens physically, it happens as a physical event, right? It's just one thing after another after another. So you don't have obstacles and interruptions and such. You got stuff that's unexpected. You got some stuff that's surprising. But that's more about how you're looking to the future predictively than it is about the natural world. Okay? When all those astrophysicists couldn't work out why those distant galaxies seem to be spinning faster and faster, and postulated dark matter, and then eventually dark energy, to try to explain that sort of stuff, what they were doing was fixing a theory to try to make it match what was going on, not trying to correct something out there in the world that wasn't working properly, in the way you might change your favorite chicken soup recipe if it was just a little off or something, okay? Now, David Hume was the first to notice that there's something very odd about this kind of scientific, wissenschaftlich orientation to the future. Right. And Hume's famous problem of induction is a problem about understanding this kind of orientation to the future. If all we're doing is going on the basis of past experience, right, what are our grounds for expecting things to happen in a similar way in the future? It turns out that the only grounds we have for that go kind of like this. Well, look, in the past futures followed the pattern that was set by past pasts. You can see that there's a problem making a leap there into, you know, and so the sun will rise tomorrow or something, okay? As far as I know, right, nobody has quite figured out how to solve Hume's problem of induction, although there's vast attempts. They usually involve the importation of a particular kind of process or force into the middle of it, and it's not clear where the grounds for that lie. But however they deal with all of that, right, the logic of what will happen next is fundamentally different from the logic of what's supposed to happen next. What's supposed to happen next, right here, is that I'm supposed to read through the next bit of the talk, having read through the last bit of the talk. Now, that's not necessarily what will happen next. If the ceiling suddenly caves in, if assassins burst through the door and go, Vogler, your day is up, something like that, chances are very good that what's supposed to happen won't happen, okay? But that doesn't mean that it's false that that's what was supposed to happen. It means there was a big interruption or obstacle. What we were expecting got snuffed out when I did. Okay. Now, to get a sense for the importance of this distinction between sort of prediction and an orientation to what's supposed to happen next, what I'm going to do is take you with me on my walk to campus. And I'm going to pretend that I'm going to walk to campus as a mere like predictor or foreseer of events. I'm avidly predicting my own moves and their results. Okay, so I'm leaving home, I'm heading for campus. I'm avidly predicting stuff. So there's what I propose to do, walk to campus. There's how I expect things will turn out. I'll get to campus. And there's no room for a supposed to in my equation. I am a woman of science. I'm only interested in the facts, like Dragnet, okay? The first, why is that some kind of a problem? Well, I mean, the first thing to be said here is that the calculative structure of my little walk all by itself is trafficking in thought about what's supposed to happen next. The like one foot in front of the other thought thing, that's done in order to make my way to campus, crossing particular streets, all that stuff, that's done in order to get here. Provided that I have my wits about me and that my choice of means is not hopelessly twisted or in error, A-ing, like walking out the door, is supposed to enable being, continuing my progress to campus, and so on. And it's because of this structure and because of the kind of low-level thought about what's supposed to happen next that it's at its center that we can identify cases when I face an obstacle or an interruption with respect to this walk. It's usually road work, frankly, on this part of the world. If there's nothing that's supposed to happen next, then there's nothing that can count as an obstacle or an interruption to what I'm doing. Nothing. There's just what happens. And however we try to make sense of the phenomenology of taking a strictly predictive stance to my own acts, kind of like this huge, what will she wear next movie for me? Like, what will Candace do next? One foot in front of the other. However we try, the difficulty there, losing the ability to discern obstacles and interruptions begins to erode a distinction between what's orientation to what's supposed to happen next and prediction. But why not combine my worldly wisdom with my means and skill? Why not just have it that what's supposed to happen next is exactly what I expect will happen next? I don't give much thought to whether what I propose to do is something that's ordinarily good or always bad or neither. My only concern is with how effective I can be at getting the desired result. And this brings me to a more substantive point. Only a subset of my act's consequences will be things that I intend. And we need to be able to pick out the intended ones in order to isolate and identify my act. No problem, I say, as an adept foreseer of consequences who steers her course by informed expectations, let my intention encompass all that I foresee. I'm happy to face the consequences of what I do. Keep your spineless moral squeamishness to yourself. I know how to get results, and get results I will. Buoyed up by my stirring self-talk, I set off toward campus to teach. On the way, I do many things. I alter the traffic pattern by hitting the signal at the crosswalk and crossing the street. I startle a cat that was stalking a bird in the vacant lot on the corner. I wear down the soles of my shoes. I think about my students, my family, the day ahead. I nod to the neighbors, and so on. Many of these consequences are foreseen. Startling the cat isn't foreseen when I leave home, but it becomes a foreseen consequence when I notice the cat and what it's up to and how it responds to me. The foreseen consequences are also events that will have consequences of their own. Now, since I'm determined to take responsibility for all the foreseen consequences of my actions, impeding the progress of drivers and disrupting the cat's attempt to catch a bird are accounts of what I'm doing that are of exactly the same sort as the one that focuses on heading to campus to teach my class. There's no way to choose among them because I know all of this stuff. Accordingly, I could just as well focus on the cat's future or the driver's as on my teaching and trying to figure out the consequences of my action. I am a causal force moving through the world, initiating many chains of events each time I do anything on purpose. The cat's future and the future of its targeted prey lie along one subsequently branching causal chain. Each driver's future might take off from the single point of stopping at the pedestrian light that I triggered by pressing a button. Of course, scaring a cat and impeding some drivers do not belong to the intended order of my act. Walking to school was not my, tremendously inefficient means to the end of interfering with traffic and cats. Like, if that's what I wanted to do, there's better means. Okay. Leap into the road. Something. Okay. So I might try this. Okay. Only the welcome consequences, the consequences that I in particular want to bring about, are properly assigned to my walk to campus. I didn't want to wear down the soles of my shoes, so that was unintentional. I took no interest in disrupting the cat, so that was unintentional. I had no bone to pick with the motorists. I just wanted to get to campus. So doing a thing that may have altered the whole shape of their days, that was unintentional, and so on. I could try that. Look, that's not going to work. Here's an example. I didn't want to ruin you. I hardly know you. I just needed the money. Okay? We can discuss that in more detail if you want. The upshot of this kind of thinking is that trying to avoid the fundamental orientation to what's supposed to happen next, trying to handle all that future-directed thinking that's there in action on the model of predicting events, is going to wind up leaving us with no good way of talking about action at all. Acting and assessing action turns on considering what's supposed to happen next, whether or not what's supposed to happen actually comes about. Now, unfortunately, this kind of supposed to covers any case where we take sound means to our ends. And our ends can be terrible, and the means can be awful. There are tried and true techniques for doing terrible things in awful ways. There are like recipe books for deadly poisons that will be hard to detect once the victim has died. There are carefully wrought plans for defrauding people. There's like worlds of practical knowledge associated with things like thievery and murder. Ask anybody who likes crime novels. They will know this. All of these set out effective means to pretty dreadful ends. All of the people who rely on this stock of dark know-how do so with the thought that if they're careful, these techniques should result in success. So means-end orientation is hardly going to help us find the good that everyone is somehow supposed to be seeking, even if we allow that the thieves and murderers doubtless think that they stand to gain something desirable in doing what they do. We can move toward a more robust account of how to understand that ancient idea about goodness, reason, and action by thinking about responsibility. Here are two things that we all understand about responsibility. Don't worry if you don't recognize these ideas. The chances are very good that they frame how you think about action and policy, whether or not you have ever said them aloud to yourself. 1. I am responsible for the bad consequences of my bad acts, but get no credit for any good that comes of them. 2. I get credit for the good that comes of my good deeds, but I'm not responsible for bad in the same way, for bad that happens to come of genuinely good deeds. Okay. The framing assumption here is that good, the real stuff, not just the like thin thing you need in order to make acts intelligible or something, is supposed to come of a genuinely good deed. A good result is the foreseeable outcome of a good act, notwithstanding sayings like no good deed ever goes unpunished. In short, even if we can predict with some confidence that a bad result will follow from a good deed, this need not be a strike against the good deed. Consider a couple of examples to see how this works. First example, infrastructure improvement. Suppose that there are some tribal villages in northern India that are isolated from each other and from any system of highways to other parts of the country. Sorry. The villagers want to see their villages connected by paved roads, and for those paved roads to be connected to a larger highway system. Building the roads will allow for easier communication and commerce between the villages and will facilitate not only like local trade, but trade with the rest of the world, and also things like delivery of healthcare and educational services to the villages. For all these reasons and more, everyone wants to see these roads built and maintained. A lot of good outcomes attend this kind of infrastructure innovation. Okay? And if all of the research into village life is solid and the engineering and construction work on the roads is sound, then building and maintaining the roads is a good sort of thing to do. Now, here's something that's perfectly predictable about our new highways. In a region where traffic accidents were rare and traffic fatalities virtually unheard of, there will begin to be more and more serious traffic accidents once these roads are in place. Absolutely predictable. Now, it belongs to ordinary moral understanding that the engineers, builders, and funders of the new highway system are not setting out to kill people by building roads. You don't rightly credit them with some kind of weird murderous intent in putting these roads in place. It's not part of it. They are no more a part of the intentional actions and policies pursued in building and maintaining the new highway than disrupting drivers and cats is part of my aim in walking to campus. Substantive good is supposed to come of good acts pursued in good ways. Even perfectly predictable bad results are accidents from the point of view of what was supposed to happen next. That's on the good side. The good side is less compelling for people because, quite frankly, it's a lot harder to isolate things that people do that are all around good than it is to find things that they do that are in some way flawed. This may just be my dark vision of the world, but it comes from reading the newspaper. Okay, now consider the flip side, the bad act. Suppose I have 3 daughters. When they were young, they were a handful. But I learned that I could get them to do what I wanted through implementing this kind of small regime of terror in the house. So if, say, I just chose one of them at random to sort of beat and starve, anytime any of them did something that she wasn't supposed to do, not only would I succeed in getting the bloodied one to do what I wanted her to do, I would provide a powerful incentive for the others, for them all to police each other's conduct, since any one of them might be singled out for wretched treatment if one of them disobeyed. Okay. Now, you can make me as bad as you like. Suppose that it worked while they were at home, and suppose that as soon as they were able, as soon as the oldest sisters were able to get jobs and support everybody, they banded together and fled, taking, a little place on the other side of the city and leaving me in peace. And now suppose that something unusual happens. My girls turn out to be really good at working with children and genuinely and deeply supportive of each other. Okay. They are sterling human beings and actually pretty good citizens. And if you ask them how they got to be that way, they will tell you that they learned firsthand what it was like to live under tyranny, in fear, in massive insecurity, and so on. And that all three of them vowed never to do the kinds of things that were done to them. Okay. Now suppose that this much is true. It was precisely by doing a whole lot of personal work to begin sort of healing and so on, that they beat the odds and became truly admirable people. Do I get any credit for that? They'll tell you, without that time with me, they would not have had the knowledge that led them on the path of virtue. No, obviously I get no credit. If, on the other hand, things had gone in a more predictable way for my daughters, and they had wound up being a world of trouble to themselves and other people around them, I'd get some credit for that. I really would. Here, at last, we find a serious connection between reason, action, and an understanding of good and bad. Here we also find the genuinely deep distinction between the kind of orientation to the future that belongs to plain prediction and the kind that belongs to figuring out what to do, doing things, and assessing what's done. And although there is a significant difference in sort of the moral codes that are deployed in this sort of framework that I've just described cross-culturally, the kind of assessment of good and bad and the way this shapes the determination about who gets credit or blame for which results is breathtakingly common, shockingly, stunningly common. You can find considerable, if indirect, cross-cultural empirical evidence that practical reason really is framed by precisely this very good-bad asymmetry if you wade into something called the psychometric risk assessment literature, which I don't recommend for an otherwise pleasant day, but it's there. Over the past 2 decades, studies using something called the Slovik, Fischoff, and Liechtenstein psychometric risk assessment paradigm have been conducted in Australia, Brazil, Chile, China, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Hungary, Japan, Korea, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Sweden, Switzerland, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, among many other places. Those are the ones I've read. These studies have similar results, which is kind of stunning. Psychometric risk studies are geared to the perspective of practical reason, to the look to the future involving what's supposed to happen next. Subjects in such studies are asked to consider adopting or implementing policies, doing acts paying such and such a sum for insurance against some bad outcome, or voluntarily relying upon specific technologies. The respondents, as near as I can tell, are reporting on what's supposed to happen next if such and such is done, rather than trying to predict what will happen next. There's shocking irregularities otherwise. If you think everybody's trying to be an armchair actuary, you think everybody's bad at arithmetic. It's like that serious. Accordingly, the subjects respond differently depending upon whether what they are asked to do or support strikes them as a good sort of thing to do or as something bad. The framework inclines people to regard some prospective acts or policy as tremendously risky. Like, catastrophe will ensue if you do this or support this, right? Namely, those acts or policies that strike them as bad sorts of things to do, or bad sorts of policies to put in place and implement. And this makes sense. They are operating with the tacit understanding that anything bad that comes of such a thing is going to fall back on their doorsteps, whereas they're not going to get any credit for any good that comes of it. So the only thing to pay attention to is the likely bad, and if you think the thing is bad anyway, you're going to suppose a whole lot more bad's going to follow. We don't even know how much. Okay. So for example, cross-culturally, there's a tremendous tendency to regard preemptive military strikes as a bad sort of thing to do. And you can kind of tell this because people practically predict the collapse of whole civilizations should you make a very limited preemptive military strike. If you're alive to this framework about good and bad, you can see what they're thinking and how they're responding. So it's a very, very powerful technique to bring to bear in reading this material. By the same token, they're not going to predict bad outcomes from actions or policies that they take to be good sorts of things to do, good sorts of policies to adopt or implement. They like food aid, they like infrastructure improvement, they like bringing clean water to places that haven't had clean water. They like clearing up farming techniques in such a way that the food isn't toxic. They think that when you do these kinds of things, good happens. Any of these kinds of things a clever person will see could bring about some unintended bad result, but they're not going to figure that into it because that doesn't belong to the logic of how you assess responsibility. Make sense? Okay. So what are we going to make of the things that people do that look to be pretty shoddy, which is where we started out? Well, first off, we can say that to the extent that they do shoddy things on purpose, we're going to have to see them as going for something they take to be in some sense good or desirable if we're so much as to understand what they're up to. I mean, I think Aquinas is right about this. Most of my evidence for that comes from a lot of time spent talking to people who are like psychiatric intake nurses and stuff. So they see people doing stuff that's very, very puzzling. And most of them will tell you that there's going to be no way to talk to or help these people if you don't look for what kind of good they're trying to make happen by doing this very puzzling thing. They haven't taken a bath in months, they don't wash their clothes, they duck all the time. There's something very frightening to them about contact with their fellow human beings. They're sort of insulating themselves. So the good that they're seeking is some form of privacy. And if you're not sensitive to that, it's going to be pretty hard to help them, that kind of thing. Okay. Second, we should expect that if the doers of shoddy deeds know that they're doing things that are questionable, they are likely to be more careful about things like getting caught or causing some other sort of ruckus along the way than if they don't think that they're doing something questionable. The place where you see this most profoundly in my neighborhood has to do with corporal punishment of children, actually. Sort of as a kind of middle-class white person, I've been trained to think that that's normally a bad idea. Like we have timeouts or we talk it out or something, but we don't like whack a kid. We're past the whack a kid point. Whereas in my neighborhood on the south side, there's a whole other culture where they think that if you don't occasionally whack a kid, you spoil the kid, and that the children of people like me are filled with senses of arrogance and entitlement that their kids aren't, because nobody forcibly ever stopped one of our kids from doing their will. So there's an actual cultural difference. What that means is that if somebody like me is at the point where she just really wants to whack that kid, she's not going to do it on the bus. She's not going to do it in the grocery store. She's not going to do it down at the public beach. There's going to be some sort of, she's going to hide it, because she no longer has confidence that that's an okay kind of thing to do. It's become a questionable thing in her culture. Whereas other families in my neighborhood, you will see somebody whacking a kid on the bus or in the grocery store or on the public beach. But that's in a cultural context where the view is, you know, spare the rod, spoil the child, which is a different understanding of what it means to be a good and effective and loving parent. Okay? So if they're doing something they think is a bad kind of thing, then chances are they're going to try to do it in secret. They're going to try to take steps to cover their tracks. They may tell themselves like stories about what they're doing by using phrases that are like, notice, almost always false. Like, that was the only thing that I could do. Or, I had no other choice. This is almost never true. There's almost always something else you could do. You could laugh, for instance. Could leave the room. There's virtually always something else to do, and there's virtually always a choice. Third, if they're making no effort to hide and they're not busily telling themselves stories about why this is a reasonable thing to do here and now, we should suppose that either they don't know that they're doing something questionable, little kids sometimes, older people sometimes, or that they're in some sort in extremis in a way that makes it impossible for them to kind of care about that. That can happen when life is really hard. Or that they're actually operating with a moral code that's in some respects different from ours, like the two different parenting norms that are occupied in my neighborhood. Taken together, these thoughts do, I think, actually give some support to the ancient idea that we operate under the guise of the good, and I strongly suspect that this is as true for hipsters as it is for squares. Thank you. My root interest in everything I do in this like super abstract philosophy stuff has to do with trying to think about the way we live together and what it would mean to do this decently, in a way that was ethically sound, deeply humane, and appropriately egalitarian. I got that in me, which, I don't know, square maybe, or whatever. But, and so, yeah, of course I'm interested in those things. This started as a project that was particularly about kinds of acts that it's never okay to do. Okay, Aristotle has a few examples of them in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says that these are acts whose names imply badness. There is, he says, no mean with respect to these acts. They're never good to do. In the 20th century particularly, I think, we've seen the invention of names for collective actions mostly that are never okay to do. Genocide, Not even just a little one. There's not very many of them, and they're filthy. Not even a little one is okay. Genocide is the name of a kind of act, and because it's the name of a kind of act that it's never okay to do, there's been a tremendous amount of attention devoted to trying to figure out what kinds of things are instances of genocide. Obviously, if I round up all your people and put you in a camp and murder you, that's genocidal. But if I take away your kids when they're really little and won't let them learn or speak your language and won't let them practice your religion and won't let them know anything about your culture, this also is a way of attacking a whole people by preventing there from being a new generation that can actually carry forward with that kind of life. So there's been an enormous amount of attention devoted to what kind, when you've got one of these concepts, a moral prohibition concept, right? There's an enormous amount of attention that gets paid to trying to figure out what counts as an act of that type. Rape is another one, right? Rape is another morally prohibited act, has been for a really long time, really long time. In the 20th century, it used to be the case that it was inconceivable that a man could rape his wife. How could a man rape his wife? The marriage gives him automatic rights to her person. It's not possible. We now think it is possible for a man to rape his wife. We think it's possible for a person to get raped by somebody she's gone out on a date with. Right? We think it's possible for a man to rape his children. Under an old regime of moral coding where the man basically had a property interest in his wife and his kids, it was not clear that that was a possibility. So I'm very interested in that kind of stuff. I tend to agree with you. I think torture is the name of a morally prohibited kind of act. So I think it's never okay to do it. Not even a little bit. Not even a little torture, now and then, where it's actual torture. It's not some kind of weird bondage game or something among consenting adults who wear black leather, right? But I mean, actually, you know, and I think that part of the way you can see the badness in these sorts of acts is that they go right at our humanity in a really deep way. I mean, the way in which our sexual being is part of our humanity and the integrity of our person is part of our humanity, that's attacked in things like rape. The way that having a collective life that's devoted to seeking a common good belongs to our basic humanity is what is going on when genocide is seen as a terrible thing. And I think that torture normally aims, what's interesting about torture is that it relies upon a deep understanding of our humanity, a really deep understanding. I mean, you can, with other animals, the only way, well, as near as I can tell, it might be that you can damage another animal by hurting its offspring where it can see. But it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to injure another kind of animal by hurting its great-grandparents or a record of their life in a place where it can see. It belongs to human beings that sometimes the way that you force them in a violent and hideous way to do what you want is by things like desecrating their sacred objects, right? By injuring members of their family or threatening to injure members of their family. All that in addition to the sheer assault on the integrity of the person that goes on in most cases of physical torture. And I think that's not a thing it's okay to do to one another, like ever. It's my view.
Conflict with each other.
Well, if there's a lot of checks on an expression of intention, okay? When I was pretending that that I got to not be responsible for ruining you because all I was doing was trying to find a way to get a little extra money, right? That was me attempting to latch on to one preferred way of describing what I was up to. I could have taken a job washing dishes on the weekend, but instead, fraud. With something like genocide, or rape, or murder, or torture, because these are generally understood to be morally prohibited kinds of action, there's been an enormous amount of attention paid to trying to isolate whether your insistence that all you're trying to do is a little bit of military intervention in a time of war holds up as a description of what you're doing. With these exceptionally violent kinds of acts, one of the things that's interesting about them and makes them so difficult to sort out philosophically is that I don't have to do the thing under that description in order to be culpable for the very bad act, right? This is, I guess, it's been most publicized around things like rape, right? There were a lot of cases of women getting raped around fraternities. Not here, we don't have a great big fraternity system here. You know, the fraternity system here is just a little thing. But in places where fraternity life is huge, there have been a lot of cases where women have been raped in connection with fraternity functions. And it's not always clear that the young men who were the perpetrators of those rapes thought of themselves as raping somebody. That doesn't mean they're not culpable for raping somebody. It might be that it's a little, the word genocide has been retroactively used to describe kinds of collective actions that took place a long time before that term was invented after World War II to try to cover the atrocities in the concentration camps. That you can retrofit it and say, you know what, there's something genocidal in the transatlantic African slave trade, for instance, or in some aspects of the United States policy with respect to Native Americans at particular periods of time, is showing you that the perpetrators do not have to think of what they're doing, you know, in precisely those terms for it to count as one of those actions. In that sense, especially with these morally prohibited act types, there's usually checks on expressions of intention. I mean, there's ways that you can see, right? Suppose I'm somehow a subordinate in some military operation that is that's doing very terrible things someplace, very terrible things. And afterwards, everybody in my company is hauled before some court because the claim is that we've done something really awful. And I tell you, look, I was just following orders. I really wasn't, you know, it was not my idea. I didn't vote on this, these orders were not mine. I was just following the orders I was given. I was being a good soldier. Even in that kind of case, there's ways you can think about it. So when I'm off duty, right, is there anything that I do to try to make the people that I say was torturing more comfortable? Is there anything I try to do to mitigate right? Am I the one who's inventing new things to do when we're all charged with torturing these political prisoners or something? Am I the one that says, hey, here's a thought? or am I the one who's trying to keep it held back as much as possible? There's a lot of ways that you work your way around thinking through an individual case to see whether the sentence that I say because I don't want to be responsible for having done something really awful is true. That's an excellent question. The question was, are the moral concepts at issue here transcendental, or are they basically culturally relative? I think that this framework, good's supposed to come of good. You're not responsible for the bad, you're less responsible for the bad consequences of a good deed, right, than you are. I mean, but the good all comes back to you. Bad, you should expect bad to follow on the heels of bad, and it's all your fault when you started it. That strikes me as transcendental. That strikes me as part of the basic architecture. Now, how you're going to fill that in any particular case is going to be with particular, specific kinds of things that are understood as good or bad. And that's culturally relative. Does that make sense? Yes. So, both the white middle-class parents and the African-American parents in my neighborhood want to do right by their children. And they're trying to take acts that are going to enable their children to grow up and be healthy, happy, productive adults. One group thinks that physical punishment, occasional, lightweight, not, beating to a pulp, but occasional whack kind of physical punishment is part of equipping their children to be those people. The other group thinks that it's not okay to do that with your kids. So the concrete concepts that they're working with differ. There's an actual cultural difference, even though everybody lives within 4 blocks of everybody else. Like, you don't have to leave the country to find cultural difference. So that part of it, but it's going to mean that if somebody like me whacks her kid, she's going to feel like she's done something bad and worry that more bad is going to come from it. That she may have hurt her child in a way that's going to have a more lasting effect than just the initial little whack did. Whereas the other mother is going to think that if she can't bear to physically stop her child from doing something really awful, kids can be really awful sometimes. I mean, I love them, right? And it's not like adults being really awful, ever, right? But they can do things that are at the very least hurtful to other children and deeply inconvenient to us, right? She thinks that if she can't bear to do that occasionally to her kid, that she may be producing a child who's not going to learn a certain sort of discipline that the child's really going to need to get on in the world. So she's going to worry if she can't, occasionally use a physical intervention to restrain a child. In exactly the way that the mother who looks like me is going to be super worried if she slips at some point and does a physical intervention with the kid. The framework is the same. How they fill it out depends upon the way that they understand themselves to be trying to pursue the good things associated with family.
And couldn't different cultures tolerate comfortably small degrees of torture?
They won't, okay. The easiest, you can't get at quite what torture is. I mean, you need to say sort of something about what torture is to do that line. The easier case is something like murder, okay? As near as I can tell, as long as there have been groups of people, one of the things that people have done is killed each other. It's just one of the things we do. And in almost every society, there's some kinds of killing of other people that's like okay. And there's other kinds of killing of other people that's really not okay. And they will differ in their sense of what kind of killing of other people is okay and what kind is not okay. If you reserve the word murder for the kind of killing of people that is deeply not okay, undertaken individually, right, under my own steam, instead of as, an executioner for the state of Illinois or something, then what I think you're going to find is that for the not okay kind of killing, this framework will apply. People will think that if I'm doing the not okay kind of killing, it's hard to know where the damage from that is going to end. And I am going to be responsible for that ongoing train wreck that is the result of my having deliberately done a kind of killing that's not okay. Okay? So that's how I would go at it. What you're going to have to say is that how the Crow understood the kind of killing that was not okay back in, 1800 is really different from the way that we understand the kind of killing that's not okay now.
I wanted to ask about method. Aristotle obviously was a great observer, and I'm very curious that you used psychological risk assessment, and you also mentioned interviewing people who were mentally disturbed, I believe.
And they were intake nurses, right?
So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how frequent that has become in philosophy. I mean, I remember my philosophy class, nobody ever cited a risk aversion study or did so-called field work.
Well, I mean, I'm a very flat-footed sort of a philosopher. Like, I work on these hyper-abstract problems in moral philosophy, but I feel like the only way I can cope with them is by keeping my feet on the ground. Keeping my feet on the ground means trying to understand how these are actually playing out in the texture of life, human life, in lots of different places. So I'm more inclined to try to learn from those sorts of sources than a lot of people. Some people would say that I'm, somehow sullying my beautiful abstract work with this empirical dross. That's a different way of approaching these questions. My feeling is that when you're doing moral philosophy, you're absolutely answerable to the way that moral life goes for people day in and day out. That's what you're supposed to be making philosophy about. So it's really important to keep track of how people live, how they pursue good, how they understand what makes their lives meaningful, if you want to make philosophy about it, because you have to answer to that. That's the first order of what you do. Does that?
Thank you.
Yes.
A virus has been stolen and about to be released in Chicago. 1 million people will die. We have the suspect. I want to save 1 million people. That's really a good thing to do. There's only one way to save them. It's to get that information to prevent this. I have the suspect. There's only one way to get them to talk.
How do you know that? A, what's the empirical evidence that the material that you elicit from those conditions is actually accurate? It's next to none. It's next to zero, the probability that what somebody tells you under conditions of torture is true. Like, it's majestically unlikely. How do you know that that's the only way to get the relevant information? It's like, maybe the way to get the information is to sit down with the guy and try to figure out why he wants to kill 1 million people. Like, what's that about? Why did that seem like something to do?
Got 12 hours.
Everybody makes up these examples this way. These examples usually rely on the thought that people who are being tortured just will tell you the truth rather than not. That there's only 12 hours to find something. That you can be absolutely certain that you've got the right guy. You didn't get his like twin brother. You didn't get his next door neighbor. You didn't get the lesser being on the totem pole who was forced to pretend to be the one guy who knows by this hideous organization that's setting out to destroy life in the city of Chicago, right? I mean, all this stuff gets engineered into these kinds of examples. It's almost never true. You almost never actually encounter a situation like this. The closest I can think of to this kind of thing is from like Die Hard movies, right? Where there really is, you know, it's like here we are, we're handcuffed and sitting on a bomb. We're handcuffed together sitting on a bomb. And you happen to be a locksmith. And I happen to have a hunk of wire stuck in my, right, and I get it out with my teeth and get it dropped into your hand. Then you can pick the lock and release us so that I can defuse the bomb and we can go free or something. That is really good for suspense in a movie, but that's almost never what's going on in these kinds of situations in life. Almost never. It's almost always false that there's only one thing to do. It's almost never true. I mean, it's almost always false outside of Hollywood movies that that's the case. But yes, you can invent those cases, and yes, what somebody like me is going to have to say is, better evacuate everybody. Better get everyone out of the city as quickly as you possibly can. What we need to do now is get every adjacent state, everybody in Indiana with a multi-passenger vehicle. We need to get them all in Chicago. We need to get all of us out of here. We need to figure out whether it's targeting our water or the air. If it's targeting the air, we need to get everybody as much as we can equipped to avoid that. We need to protect our citizens. And I am, because of believing that there are such things as moral prohibition and that there is one on torture, I'm stuck having to have more of an imagination around these cases than is strictly speaking comfortable. But I think in life it's better to have more of an imagination around difficult moral circumstances, really difficult ones, than not. So it's not too awful for me. But I understand, my fellow philosophers make up examples like this all the time.
I don't think we have to make them up, just phrases.
I know, it's just that what's also a reality is that empirically the evidence is that almost none of the information that's extracted from people under these conditions is actually useful. Almost none. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty, the thing is, I mean, the way I think about it, it's like, suppose that this circle contains inside of it all the kinds of things that might be good to do here and now. What's the boundary line around that circle? It's the very few kinds of things it's never okay to do. That's what sets the limits for practical reason, I think. That's the picture I'm trying to pursue in this big project that I gave you this weird little précis of today. And yes, it means I'm committed to there being moral prohibitions. And yes, that means I have to swallow all the awfulness, bite the bullet that goes with thinking that there are moral prohibitions, but I'm willing to go out on that limb. Never okay to vivisect kids. Never. Quite happy to say that. Never okay to torture, never okay to rape, never okay to collectively commit genocide. Never okay. You need a bigger imagination than that for dealing with a difficult circumstance. So, but it is a bullet to bite, and it does cost in exactly this case, because it may mean that people die because somebody's not willing to do a wrong thing. Thank you.